Hello students, I'm Sunanda Maini and I'm here to take up another chapter of English with you, Indigo. Now, Indigo has been written, it is an excerpt from a book written by Louis Fisher. The name of the book is The Life of Mahatma Gandhi, and it is one of the best books that has ever been written on Mahatma Gandhi. Now, this particular excerpt is about the struggle that Gandhiji waged against the Britishers to get rid of the indigo sharecropping business going on in Jamparan. We will come to the chapter's details very soon, and before I go further, I want to tell you one thing, that this particular incident was a turning point in the struggle for freedom, and after this the non-cooperation movement kicked off, and that is how Gandhiji got rid of Britishers from India. Now the chapter is about Raj Kumar Shukla, a poor peasant who came to Gandhiji for help. He came there where Gandhiji was attending a convention of All India Congress in 1916, and he urged to Gandhiji to come to Champaran and solve the woes of the farmers, because he knew that only Gandhiji could get rid of that system which was very oppressive and unjust. When he came to Gandhiji, Gandhiji told him that he was very busy, he had to go to Kanpur and so on and so forth, so he was quite occupied with the nationalist movements and all. But Raj Kumar Shukla was very firm and determined in his resolve, because he knew that only Gandhiji could solve the problem of the peasants of Champaran. Under an ancient arrangement, the Champaran peasants were sharecroppers. That means they were cropping indigo on the land of the Britishers, and the entire produce was taken by Britishers as rent of that land. Rajkumar Shukla followed Gandhiji everywhere, and he ultimately followed him to the ashram, where he got a chance to talk to him, and he told him, please fix a date, and ultimately Gandhiji agreed to go to Champaran in 1917. So months passed. Shukla was sitting on his haunches at the appointed spot in Calcutta when Gandhi arrived. He waited there till Gandhi was free, and then the two of them boarded a train to Bihar. First of all, they went to Rajendra Prasad's house, who was a lawyer at that time, and later he became the first president of Indian Congress as well as India. So they went there. Rajendra Prasad was not there at home. Gandhiji was mistaken to be another peasant along with Rajkumar Shukla, but they were made to stay there the night. And the next day, Gandhiji wanted to collect some more information. So they went to Muzaffarpur, where another Indian revolutionary, J.B. Kriplani, was informed. He, along with his many students, came to receive Gandhiji, and Gandhiji started collecting facts about this situation from Kriplani and his associates. Now, Gandhiji stayed there for 2 days in the home of Professor Malkhani, a teacher in a government school. It was an extraordinary thing in those days. Why? Because it was not very comfortable and safe for government employees to give any kind of support to any revolutionary. So people were in general very scared of giving any support to the revolutionaries, but Professor Malkhani was bold enough to give them accommodation in his own house. There many advocates came there. They were in smaller localities. The Indians were afraid to show sympathy for advocates of home rule. Advocates of home rule means those who were in favor of the rule by Indians. So many advocates came to Muzaffarpur to meet Gandhiji and brief him about the facts of the case. And during their conversation, it was revealed that they were charging quite heftily from the poor peasants. Now Gandhiji did not like this and he scolded the lawyers that you being Indians are not helping the poor peasants at all. Those poor farmers were paying their entire produce to the Britishers just as rent, and in addition to that, you were charging them so heftily. So you had in fact to support them. They were your fellow brothers, they were your fellow Indians, and he was not at all happy with that. So he decided to change the line of action. He said, I have come to the conclusion that we should stop going to the law courts. Taking such cases to the courts does little good. Where the peasants are so crushed and fear-stricken, law courts are useless. The real relief for them is to be free from fear. He decided at that time that the peasants did not need any relief from the courts. All they needed was relief from fear. Now, under the old arrangement, the estates were owned by the British landlords and they wanted the Indian farmers to grow indigo on 15% of the land. And the entire produce was taken by the Britishers as rent of the land. But somehow they had found synthetic indigo from Germany, cheaper option. So they wanted the Indian peasants to stop cropping indigo on their land. But in order to free the peasants from this kind of arrangement, they were charging them very heftily. Some farmers who were scared of them had signed the pact willingly, but some of them were rebelling against it. And the case was that they wanted relief from the court. They wanted their money back. Now, Gandhiji observed that most of the arable land in Champaran district was divided into large estates owned by Englishmen and worked by Indian tenants. The chief commercial crop was indigo. The landlords compelled all tenants to plant 3/20ths or 15% of their holdings with indigo and surrender the entire indigo harvest as rent. This was done by long-term contract. So to free them from this contract, they were asking for money, whereas they did not need the synthetic, they did not need the natural indigo at all. They were buying synthetic indigo from Germany at a much cheaper price. Those who had paid, they wanted their money back, and that was the whole case about. Now the sharecropping arrangement was irksome to the peasants and many signed willingly. Those who resisted engaged lawyers. The landlords hired thugs. So that was the kind of Cold War going on between the lawyers of that place and the landlords, because the lawyers were insisting to free the peasants by not charging anything, whereas the landlords wanted to charge them for freeing them from this kind of arrangement. So it went on for a long time, but nothing much was coming out. Now Gandhiji arrived at this point, and first he visited the secretary of the British Landlords Association because he wanted to collect some more facts. Somehow he did not get much information from the secretary there, so he decided to call on a British official commissioner of Tirhut division in Jamparan district, but the commissioner, instead of helping him, told him to leave. Now Gandhiji did not pay heed to what the commissioner said. Instead, he decided to go to Motihari. That is the capital of Jamparan. Several lawyers accompanied him there. At the railway station, he was greeted by many more lawyers. Now he started staying there in a house, and From there, he started operating and gathering more information about the case. One day, he got a news that a peasant had been ill-treated in a nearby village. So he wanted to go there. He was going there in his carriage when on the way he was stopped and a messenger gave him the message to go back. Gandhiji complied and came back. When he was there in his own house, he was served summons which ordered him to leave Jamparan at once. Gandhiji refused and he said that he would not go back and he would prefer to disobey the order. In consequence, Gandhiji was sent instructions that he had to appear before the court next day. So that night had been busy. He kept on collecting information from here and there, and he sent a message to his friend Rajendra Prasad to come to Bihar with some influential persons. Now Motihari was now full of peasants and lawyers who were there to support Gandhiji. There were demonstrations going on, and it seemed that it was not easy to control the crowd. The authorities over there urged Gandhiji to help them manage the situation and keep it under control. So Gandhiji was proved to be quite powerful at that time, and the authorities became well aware of the fact that he was the only one who could control a mob or a crowd demonstrating outside. The prosecutor requested the judge to postpone the trial. Apparently, the authorities wished to consult their superiors. So next day when Gandhiji appeared in the court, the trial was postponed because the authorities, they wanted to consult their superiors and decide the course of action. Now Gandhiji protested against delay. He read a statement pleading guilty. So he very openly confessed that yes, he was guilty of not obeying the orders, and he said that he was involved, he told the court, in a conflict of duties. Now these lines are important. On one hand, not to set a bad example as a lawbreaker. That means he did not want to be termed as a lawbreaker. He was only involved in a conflict of duties. What duties? On the other hand, to render humanitarian and national service for which he had come. He disregarded the order to leave, not for want of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being. The voice of conscience, he asked the penalty due. So he confessed openly that yes, he was guilty of not obeying the orders of the commissioner, but he was only listening to his inner conscience, which had awakened him to do his duty towards his countrymen. So he was obeying the higher law. He regarded the law of his conscience, which reminded him of his duty towards his country and his countrymen. He regarded that law to be much higher than the law of that place. The magistrate announced that he would pronounce sentence after a 2-hour recess and asked Gandhiji to furnish a bail for those 2 hours, but Gandhiji refused. He was then allowed to move freely even for those 2 hours. Why? Because the authorities were convinced that whatever they do, they cannot curb the nationalist spirit in Gandhiji, and everybody just followed him. Rajendra Prasad, Brij Kishore Babu, Maulana Mazharul Haq and several other prominent lawyers had arrived from Bihar. They conferred with Gandhiji, means they held discussions with Gandhiji, and they all decided that if Gandhiji were to be arrested, then they would go back. Now this was really a surprise for Gandhiji, because he thought that Indian lawyers were there to help the peasants. So he again chided them and asked them that what will become of the Indian peasants? What about the injustice that is being done to them by the Britishers? So what he wanted was that even if he was arrested, if orders were passed to arrest him, at least the lawyers should continue to fight for those poor peasants in his absence. This really woke up their consciousness, and they all decided that if Gandhiji were arrested, even they would court arrest along with him. So they all lined up there along with the peasants. This was the victory of the Battle of Champaran, because Gandhiji was sure at that time, now if the peasants were ready to court arrest along with him, that means they were not scared of Britishers. And this is what he wanted. He wanted the fear to come out of their minds. They accordingly went back to Gandhi and told him they were ready to follow him into the jail. The Battle of Champaran is won, he exclaimed. So that was a big victory for Gandhiji, because his first aim was to get rid of the fear from the minds of the poor peasants and then get them justice. Now, several days later, Gandhiji received a written communication from the magistrate informing him that the lieutenant governor of the province had ordered the case to be dropped. Civil disobedience had triumphed the first time in modern India. So this was the beginning of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience means that people in general stopped obeying the orders of the authorities. Now Gandhi and the lawyers now proceeded to conduct a far-flung inquiry into the grievances of the farmers. So various facts were collected, various documents were collected, evidences, and then a committee was formed to look into the grievances of the farmers. And Gandhiji was a member of that committee. He was representing the farmers, and documents were collected. The whole area throbbed with the activity of investigators and the vehement protests of the landlords. The landlords were, of course, uncomfortable with this kind of arrangement. They had the fear of losing money. They had to return the money. That was what the case was about. In June, Gandhi was summoned to Sir Edward Gate, the lieutenant governor. So before he went, he met the leading associates and again laid detailed plan for civil disobedience if he should not return. So Gandhi was not sure whether he would be able to return safely or not, but he planned that in case of his arrest, civil disobedience movement would follow. That means everybody would court arrest. Nobody would obey the orders of the authorities. Gandhi had 4 protracted interviews with the lieutenant governor, who as a result appointed an official commission of inquiry into the indigo sharecroppers situation. These kind of things went on for a long time, and ultimately Gandhi remained there in Champaran for an initial uninterrupted period of 7 months, and then again for several shorter visits. But it was the official inquiry assembled a crushing mountain of evidence against the big planters, and when they saw this, they agreed in principle to make refunds to the peasants. Now, after all the evidences and documents, the landlords agreed to refund the money to the peasants. So that was a big victory. Now the question arose, how much? How many rupees, how much percentage of the money was to be returned to the poor peasants? They thought Gandhi would demand repayment in full of the money which they had illegally and deceitfully extorted from the sharecroppers. But Gandhiji asked only for 50% of the refund. Gandhiji was not worried about money. All he wanted was that the peasants should not be scared of landlords at all. That was the first victory for him. And the second victory was that the landlords agreed to pay back. So that was a big victory again for Indians, because they could have their will. And He asked for only 50%. There he seemed adamant. But in the end, he agreed that the planters offered to refund to the extent of 25%, and to his amazement, Gandhi took him at his word, thus breaking the deadlock. So in the end, Gandhi agreed to take back only 25% of the money which the peasants had paid to the landlords to get themselves free from the arrangement of sharecropping. Now, this settlement was adopted unanimously by the commission. Gandhiji justified this kind of arrangement by saying that for him, money was not important, but the important thing was that a refund was made by the Britishers. The Britishers had to bow down to the wishes of poor Indians. That was a big victory for him, and this episode in Jamparan turned out to be a turning point. This was the beginning of civil disobedience movement in India. Now, Gandhiji never contented himself with large political or economic solutions. He was not satisfied by just getting them justice politically, but he was now bothered about their cultural and social backwardness. The villagers in Champaran were backward culturally as well as socially. So he called volunteers from his own ashram. Till then he had been managing the accounts and all the affairs of his ashram from Champaran. He called volunteers from there, and teachers, he appealed for teachers also to come and educate the masses in Jamparan. So Mahadev Desai and Narhari Parekh, two young men who had just joined Gandhi as disciples, and their wives volunteered for the work. So these people came to Champaran to help the villagers there. Now Devdas, Gandhi's youngest son, arrived from the ashram, and so did his wife Kasturba Bai. They taught the ashram rules on personal cleanliness and community sanitation. This was the first lesson to the people living in Champaran. Health conditions were miserable. Gandhi got a doctor to volunteer his services for 6 months, and 3 basic medicines, castor oil, quinine and sulfur ointment, were available for everybody free of cost. They were administered to the villagers in case of minor problems. The doctor was there to administer them. Anybody with skin eruptions received ointment plus castor oil, and anybody with a coated tongue was given a dose of castor oil. So malaria, anybody with malaria fever received quinine. So the basic health facilities were provided in the village, and Gandhi noticed the filthy state of women's clothes. So Kasturba undertook the mission to educate the women of the village about the hygiene and sanitation in the village. Look, there is no box or cupboard here for clothes. The sari I am wearing is the only one I have. So this was very common among the women of the village, but Kasturba educated them about cleanliness and hygiene in their personal affairs and in their surroundings outside. The Champaran episode was a turning point in Gandhi's life. What I did, he explained, was a very ordinary thing. I declared that the British could not order me about in my own country. So that was the beginning of defiance. Gandhiji actually made it very loud and clear that he could not be ruled and he could not be dictated terms by the Britishers, and everybody followed him there. But Champaran did not begin as an act of defiance. It grew out of an attempt to elevate the distress of large number of poor peasants. Elevate means to improve, to uplift. So this was the typical Gandhi pattern. His politics were intertwined with the practical day-to-day problems of the millions. His was not a loyalty to abstractions, it was a loyalty to living human beings. That means he was not loyal to the ideas. He was not just talking about the idea of freedom, but he was loyal to the human beings as such in every way. He was looking after their political freedom as well as their social and cultural freedom. So he was satisfied only when people were free in every way. In everything Gandhi did, moreover, he tried to mold a new free Indian who could stand on his feet and thus make India free. So he wanted to make them independent in every way. Only then he could dream of a free India if its people were free in every way, culturally, socially, economically, as well as politically. Early in the Champaran action, Charles Freer Andrews, the English pacifist who had become a devoted follower of Mahatma Gandhi, came to bid Gandhi farewell before going on a tour of duty to the Fiji Islands. So Charles Freer Andrews was a close devotee of Gandhiji, and people asked Gandhi to take his help in his struggle for freedom, but Gandhiji refused because he knew that the cause for which he was fighting was just. And he was very sure in his mind that when your cause is just, when your cause is right, there is no need to fear anybody. There is no need to take anybody's help, be it Britisher or Indian. So he wanted to fight for fight for freedom of India because he knew that it was their right and there was nothing wrong in it. And that's all about the chapter, students, that I need to tell you. And in my next video, I'll be back with the question answers on this chapter. Thank you.